Hi, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear. Today, I get to talk to my friend Subira Gordan, who's the executive director of an educational advocacy organization called ConnCAN here in Connecticut. But before we get to that conversation, and I introduce you to her a little more thoroughly, I wanted to bring up two terms. The first is the term racism. We've been talking about racism on the podcast for a couple of episodes now, but I want to go back and just talk a little bit about what that word means when I use it. Also, Subira brings up the word antiracist, which is a word that's being used and a concept that's being used a lot right now, but I think it's important to explain or define that term before we go throwing it about. So, racism. Often racism is thought of as overt acts of hostility or bigotry from one individual to another. We usually, particularly in America, think about that as someone who is in the category called white, saying something or doing something that is overtly hateful or demeaning to someone who is considered not white. That is racism on some level, but when we are talking about racism here, we're actually talking about more than those overt acts. And this is something I write about in White Picket Fences in the chapter that we're discussing, which is chapter 5. We're talking about racism as a system that involves people who have power, who are able to structure things in such a way that one group of people is able to have advantages that another group is not. And that advantage comes not by basis of hard work or life experience, but because of those demographic differences. So I just wanted to clarify what I meant by racism. And if you want to hear more on that, the episode with Patricia Raybon from earlier in the season, we talk about that distinction as well. The second thing is this term anti-racist. When I first heard the term anti-racist, I thought, who doesn't want to be against racism? Isn't everybody an anti-racist? And then I realized that what people were trying to do is distinguish and demarcate that there's a difference between saying I'm not a racist, which is a somewhat passive comment, I'm not a racist, and I'm anti-racist. I'm actively working against the systems and structures that perpetuate racism. So the people who are talking about anti-racism are talking about that work of activism and intentionality that is seeking to undo the harmful effects of a history and a current reality of racist systems and structures within our nation. We'll talk more about that on this episode. I would love to hear what you think. The other thing I will note is that this is not the highest quality audio we've ever had before, in part because my audio was just being funky and also because there was a weed whacker outside somewhere in the middle of the episode, which you may or may not hear, as well as a few dings and pings along the way. So bear with us. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. I really love Subira and love the way that she's able to take us into some of the nitty-gritty of what it means to care for kids as they seek to have the opportunity to have a great education and great prospects for their own lives later on. Thanks for joining us. Subira, it is awesome to see you. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. I know we've only just recently gotten to know each other, but I've been encouraged and excited by every conversation we've had, and I want other people to hear what you have to say. So we get to do this today, and I have you here both because I like you a lot and I've enjoyed our conversations. On an official level, I have you here because you are the executive director of an organization called ConnCAN, which is an educational advocacy organization here in the state of Connecticut. So I want to start there and just let you introduce yourself a little bit. Can you explain what ConnCAN is and also what your role is?
Hi, wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me. I too have enjoyed all of our conversations.
Well, thanks.
So my name is Subira Gordan, and I'm the executive director of ConnCAN. And ConnCAN is an educational advocacy organization that believes that every child in Connecticut has the right to an excellent public education. We believe that your zip code should not determine your future. And as we all know here in Connecticut, where you live determines the quality of school that you end up having. And that has a long-term effect on generational poverty and kind of where you end up in life. So we are fighting to make sure that despite any circumstances that you're born into, you have access to a great education. And we know that education is a great equalizer. So if you are able to access high quality education, then you're able to change the life for yourself and for your family.
So tell me how this became a passion for you, like how you personally got into this work and essentially you're like dedicating all those working hours to making this happen.
So I grew up in a small rural village in Jamaica where there was 98% illiteracy, and my mother actually started a school because I was homeschooled for a few years, and I think I drove my mother crazy. She was like, she needs to have friends to play with. And she also recognized the need that in this community, the kids at 3 years old were traveling 3 miles. And this is before cars were everywhere in Jamaica. So they're walking, and, parents had to be able to walk their small kids to school if they had older siblings. And many people in the community only went to 5th grade. Maybe a couple people had graduated from 9th grade, but no one went to high school. So she recognized that need. So she founded the school, and then before me, there were a couple of older kids who had gone to high school, graduated from high school first in the community, and I graduated from high school. And my mother decided that I needed to go to the United States for college. And so then I went to, I always say, the whitest place on earth, one of the whitest schools on earth. I went to Bates College in Maine, which was a wonderful experience. But
you also went to Maine.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't just white, it was cold.
Yeah, Maine white, and cold. But quickly, this, other than the fact that very few kids at Bates looked like me, the kids who were there had come from pretty privileged situations, had either gone to boarding school, their families were diplomats and they came in from Africa, or it was very few kids in that school had gone to what I would call a traditional neighborhood school. They were either coming from charter schools or magnets, or they had gone to boarding school. And that was like my first glimpse at educational inequity in the United States. And then graduated from Bates and did a whole bunch of things, and then started working at the legislature, I think in 2010. And
the Connecticut legislature?
Yeah, Connecticut legislature in 2010. And just heard about back then we used to call it the achievement gap, and just started doing my research, and then recognized that, a lot of what's happened in Connecticut has roots that are deeply rooted in segregation and racism and kind of housing inequity, and really looking at why is Connecticut the way that it is. And in college, I have a friend from St. Louis who used to tell me, she's like, I'm used to my Southern racists. They're racist to your face. Up north, and she would say, she's like, you guys, you're racist in how you deal with me. And I remember that, and I always will continue to, because when we think about what's happening in Connecticut, it's not overt, it's not in your face. But the minute you peel back by one layer, you can see where, if you look at how we fund schools, if you look at where neighborhoods are, if you know what kids are going to what schools in the cities, even in the cities, the schools are very segregated. There will be schools in cities like New Haven that's almost all white. Similar to Bridgeport, there are schools within Bridgeport that have lots of kids from the parents who have means. So that's what got me started in this work. And what's kept me here is, as the mother of 2 small Black kids, I believe that every child needs to have the same opportunity that they do. I want their family, their friends, their neighbors to have the same opportunities and be able to go to, whatever college they want to, or whatever career they choose to go in after high school, because I do think education is changing, and directly to college might not be the path for lots of young people right now as we're moving to a new kind of education.
So I want to make sure, because one of the sets of terms that I see or hear a lot is this difference between equality and equity. And I imagine that's going to be helpful in making sure we're talking in the same terms in this conversation and that listeners know what we're talking about. Can you explain the difference between equality and equity? Because they kind of sound like they're the same thing, but they're not quite the same thing. So could you talk about that and how it pertains to education?
Yeah, so equality is essentially giving everyone the same thing. So, for example, if, let's say, we funded schools at the same level, would be, every child got the same amount of money designated to them to go to school.
Okay.
Equity is actually giving people what they need to be successful. So, for example, there's this really cool picture that depicts it where equality is you give everyone the same block to stand on. But equity is if a person is shorter, they would get a little bit of a higher block to stand on so they could see over the fence. And in terms of education, what that means is we have to think about what impacts kids in learning. For example, students who have special ed needs, it is not, if we think about it in a space of equity, they have different needs and their needs should uniquely be met. A student who's coming in with English language learning, they have different needs and their needs need to be uniquely met. A child who's coming into school with trauma, they have unique needs and their needs need to be uniquely met. And in a situation that has equity, every child is given what they need to be successful. And to put it in terms of when we're thinking now about distance learning, I was in a call on Monday with a mom of a child who has learning differences. And she said there was an expectation that my child was going to take a computer home and type. She said my son had never typed a day in his life because his learning differences had made it where not that he wasn't capable, it was not a part of his learning plan. So how do you have an impact and how do you make sure that child gets what their needs? It's by creating a situation where there's a one-on-one, whether it's with a paraprofessional or an educator, who's helping them meet their unique needs and not handing them a laptop like you handed to every other child in the class and said, go forward and do distance learning. So that's kind of, I think, a one-on-one example specifically about the difference between equality. Equality is everyone got a laptop to go home. Equity is he has unique needs and needs. It may not be it may just doesn't need to be more expensive. It just needs to be different to fit the needs that he has.
Well, and so if I'm hearing you correctly, we would want equality is almost like a baseline because in the state of Connecticut, at least, we don't have equality in the sense of like, for that example, not every kid was sent home with a laptop in March when, things shut down. But we also have this additional concern and different concern as far as equity. But even if everybody did have the same funding and the same teacher quality and the same textbook quality and et cetera, you still have an equity problem as far as actually ensuring that kids get what they need in order to succeed. So it sounds like, to me, there's actually a both and rather than an either or going on in talking about those things. That's helpful. Thank you. Well, I want to give a little context to listeners for this episode, because in this season of the podcast, we're talking through my book, White Picket Fences. And in chapter 5 of White Picket Fences, I tell the story of when I was 10 years old, moving from this small, functionally segregated town in North Carolina to Riverside, Connecticut, which is a part of Fairfield County and is predominantly white, more than predominantly, very, very white place. And so I was going into 6th grade and I attended my neighborhood public school, walked to public school down the street. And I got a lot of comments, even just as a 10-year-old in 6th grade, about the racism from the place where I had come from, the racism I must have encountered in North Carolina. And I knew that there was a lot of truth to those comments. I didn't think that people were wrong. I wasn't trying to defend that. At the same time, I knew that where I lived now, there were very few African-American people or even people of color living in my town. And truly, as a kid, I was very aware the only time I saw people with brown skin was when we went to McDonald's and they were working behind the counter. So I was aware that there was a different inequity going on than where I had come from. And so I just saw white people all the time. And I knew there was something wrong with characterizing my town in North Carolina as racist and not thinking about this new context, at least with some sort of lens that had to do with race. So I knew that living in a homogenous community was problematic in its own ways, but I wasn't, of course, I was in middle school. I wasn't sure what to make of all that. And, the demographics of North Carolina and Connecticut are different, as every part of the United States are, but there is a history here in Connecticut that has led of policies that have led to some of the segregation that we functionally experience in terms of these white communities and communities of color. And I just wonder if you can speak to that history. Like, why did I find myself in an all-white school in a town that thought of itself as not racist?
So we can go back to the 1930s and think about redlining and the decisions that Congress made. So there were decisions, and it's interesting. I'm doing a lot of research on this topic right now because I'm very interested in kind of how school zones and like how lines were drawn to determine who goes to what school. And so neighborhoods were, literally a map was taken and a red line was drawn around certain neighborhoods, and it said, this is where white people live, and this is where, in that time it would have been African Americans, this is where they live. And if you live within a certain neighborhood, the federal government will not insure mortgages in those neighborhoods.
Right.
So it made where, and so the neighborhoods where white people lived, you were able to buy a home. Neighborhoods where Black people lived, you were not able to buy a home unless you were independently wealthy as a Black person and didn't need a mortgage, which there's probably very few of those in the 1930s. Right. And essentially, those lines that were drawn in the 1930s, neighborhoods in Connecticut today look almost the same as they did when those lines were drawn. So by default, if you think about, so the main way of accumulating wealth in the United States is by owning a home. So if you think about generational poverty, if your family was able to own a home in the 1930s, it was a part of the GI Bill for people coming back from war, you would be able to make an investment for your family and build some sort of a wealth as a springboard to move on to, whatever else you decided to do. In the Black neighborhoods where you couldn't get homes, that was not the case. Mm-hmm. So those schools, the individuals living in those cities, and specifically back then it was in the cities, they were not able to build wealth. They were working and they didn't have that kind of investment. So the schools in those neighborhoods didn't have the same kind of investments because it's funded a lot, like specifically Connecticut, schools are funded based on property taxes. So if you think about the investments that were made in the suburban, what became suburban America, or even in some cases more rural, but it's not exactly the same for rural communities. Some of those rural communities, they wouldn't have the same luxuries as the suburban communities. So schools were invested in based on the property tax values. So in the urban areas where people of color lived, there was not the property tax value for investment in schools. And so the lines were drawn in those segregated times where white kids went to this school, Black kids went to this school, and it was, separate but unequal back then. So kids would go to schools in their own neighborhoods, and those lines were never crossed. And we have not done the work here in Connecticut or, in many other places to get rid of those lines, to think about shared resources, to think about when people talk about regionalism in Connecticut, it's kind of a bad word, and, everyone wants to keep what they have, and they don't recognize that what they have was made possible by government policies that gave them a leg up and took away the opportunity from other communities. So that's why, Riverside ended up being all white. And then if you probably look right across the border in another town, it didn't. If you go right up the street to Bridgeport, that's where people of color live. Yeah, exactly.
Even closer, absolutely. The line between Old Greenwich and Stamford, I mean, it's a marked, you cross the street and you're in a different neighborhood. So when you look at that history and you say, okay, this is true now because of things that were decided 100 years ago, and we have not done the work to undo, much less to repair, right? What does that, what are you advocating for, right? Like how does that work begin to actually happen? How do we rethink and reimagine and undo the damage that happened in the past?
So the way I see it and the way we look at it at ConnCAN is you have to think of what exactly a whole family needs to be successful. So I think specifically around education, it's investing in students and thinking about what they need. So when we look at, if you think about school finance, we look at it in you invest in the need of a student and not in what was a formula that was created that, said, each child should get like a specific base amount. And then you add value to what the needs are. So if that student, I think I mentioned, has special learning differences, you would add an additional investment for that. If there is a elevated level of poverty in that community, you add another amount for that. And therefore, so when you get to a point where you're looking at how you're investing in that child, it is giving them the resources that they need to put them on a level playing field as their neighbor who lives a few towns over that may already have those investments because of how the wealth within that community. And I also think it's important that communities that are not all people of color and white communities also understand that they have a level of privilege in their own communities and think about how they could reach out, think about how they can invest in communities that don't look like theirs. I always think about something as simple as a swimming pool. If you move to a high resource community in Connecticut, you take a swimming pool for granted. The Y has there's lots of public places that have swimming pools. In cities, there's a line outside the door to get to the public pools. If we thought about that as just a shared resource. However, because of how we do things in Connecticut, the racism that's built into that, the minute 10 Black kids show up at a swimming pool in an all-white community, someone is going to call the cops and say those kids don't belong in that community. So we really need to train our kids to be anti-racists in their own being, and the communities to think of, well, these kids aren't vandalizing, they're not coming in for anything. They would just like the opportunity to have a pool on demand like your community does. So we think about things in that way and really encourage people to stretch and think beyond their own boundaries and think about, what does it mean to actually be an anti-racist? What does it mean to encourage your own kids to look beyond and think about having friends that don't look like theirs? Think about taking your kids to communities that don't look like yours and having them feel comfortable. I think one of the things I really do with my kids is I want you to feel comfortable everywhere that you go. I don't want you to feel like an outsider in an all-white community. And I don't want, if you have a friend that doesn't look like you and they come to our community, I want you to make them feel accepted and feel at home and not like an outsider in our community. So I think those are just some things that we can do as parents and that we can just do as a society if we really truly want to be anti-racist.
Yeah, we have sporadically done that as a family. We've got friends who live down in Richmond, Virginia, and our friends are highly educated white and brown people, not actually Black, but from India and Sri Lanka. They moved into a predominantly Black neighborhood. And for a couple summers when our kids were little, we went down and just spent a week in their community. And it was fascinating, the questions that came up, because, literally why does everybody have Black skin? Not a negative, just I haven't seen this before. And lots of questions that had to do with living in a city, which is also just a different context for my children. Why are all the cars parked on the street? Things like that. And then more recently, we have been intentionally just driving into Waterbury. And similarly, it's a city, this is 30 minutes from my home, where there's a much more racially diverse population. And what's been fascinating for us to see in ourselves, but also in our kids, is the sense of freedom that comes actually from being in a diverse community. We went in for a prayer gathering, so that was familiar on the one hand to my kids because they've grown up in the church. But on the other hand, there was more expressive prayer going on than is happening in our all-white church. And they felt really welcomed and I think just free by being there. But at the same time, we, living in a predominantly white community, really have to think about, how are we going to do this intentionally for ourselves and for our kids? So one question I have for you on the structural level is, should the lines be redrawn? Because obviously there's the one question of shared resources and of welcoming and kind of a posture of welcome across the lines. And maybe that's where it has to start. But ultimately, should there be, I don't know, is it that neighborhoods should be changing? Is it that neighborhood schools are not the right model? Is it just a funding question? And not, there might not be one answer here, but I'm just curious what you think, because I know we've also talked about just the significance of relationships. Relationships are not the answer, but if there aren't relationships that span some of what we see as our dividing lines, I don't think we then have the, hey, I'd love for you to come use our pool, or the pool that I think of as mine, right?
Exactly. So do I think the line should be redrawn? Absolutely. Do I think in the way that people hold community, was that possible? No. I think the way we think of community is directly connected to where we live. And I think people define themselves in their communities based on the characteristics of the communities that they live in. And I think there would be, riots in the streets if we tried to redraw the lines. Do I think that should be what we do? Absolutely. If we know that these lines were drawn in a time where it was based on segregation and racism, yes, we should absolutely redraw the lines. Right. But short of that, I do think, we have to think about relationships, and we have to think about like what is important for communities and what are the core values of your community. And if you think that, I don't know if you've seen, there's a lot of communities around Connecticut that's saying racism is a public health, it's like a public health emergency. Mm-hmm. So if you as a community believe that racism is a public health emergency, what are you doing to change the trajectory of the communities of color around you? Mm-hmm. If you're an all-white community, what are you doing to make other people feel more welcome in your own community? Many places in Connecticut don't allow multifamily homes. By having that zoning law, you are essentially affirming a racist policy, because you don't think that anyone who doesn't, and if you think about the acreage covenants that exist as well, you are not able to buy a small plot of land and build a little teeny tiny home, right? You need to buy a certain lot size. So you're essentially affirming a history of racism by not changing the ways things happen in your town. I think when it comes to education, I really believe in open choice. I really believe that families should not have to go to a specific school because all the kids in that school look like them. I think a family should have the option to decide where their kids should go. But I say that, and then I also don't believe in busing kids to different communities where they're going to feel like an outsider. So if you have an open choice policy, it needs to actually be truly open choice, not where kids are airlifted in and then they feel like outsiders in that community and they're not able to play sports with those kids. Those kids aren't really their friends. They're living two completely separate lives. I think we should affirm policies that allow for affordable housing in more higher resource communities, but also invest in cities. So families don't feel like they need to go to a different community to have a better opportunity, but they could go to a different community because they want to and they would like a different experience. So I think it's a little bit different from right now where open choice exists, where it's like, if I go to school outside of my community, I will then have a better opportunity. I think I like that choice for someone who says, I want a different experience, so then I would like to go to school in a different community. I also think that, really investing in high quality schools. I think there's a big conversation that happened in Connecticut around charter schools saying that they are really segregated. That to me shouldn't necessarily be a problem if we're not having conversations about white schools being segregated. Mm. So at the same time, there are many school districts. I remember when we were looking to buy a house, we kept looking at different communities. And my threshold for what my decision would be is what's the percentage of people in that town. And I looked at many towns where the percentage was under 1%. And
under 1% who are people of color.
And I would just say, no, there's absolutely, that meant that my son, who's school age, my daughter isn't yet, but my two kids would probably be the only Black child in their classroom for a really long time in their community. And I just didn't want to do that to them. So ConnCAN does a lot of work around teacher diversity. And we believe in this because we also believe that having authority figures that either look like you or don't look like you is incredibly important. In an all-white community,
both matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In all-white communities, kids having to respect a teacher who doesn't look like them is really important, and it would affirm anti-racist belief systems in that, despite what you see around you, or for some people in their homes, I don't know how, what conversations are being had, but you are able to see an authority figure that doesn't look like you, and you respect that person, and you recognize that, wait, okay, a person of color can become a teacher. Because I think lots of stereotypes are believed in as kids, and I think a lot of adults reaffirm those stereotypes by the behavior that they exhibit.
Yeah, so I know you've talked to me about this before, but I think you have these statistics at the ready. As far as teachers in Connecticut, mm-hmm. Most kids, correct me if I'm wrong, most kids in Connecticut, no matter what the population demographically of the student body is, mm-hmm. are being taught by white teachers. Is that correct?
90% of teachers in Connecticut are white.
90% are white. And how about students in Connecticut?
So we are close to 50%. I think we're hovering around 48% of kids are students of color. So yeah. Very vast difference there. And the state has done a lot of work to advance this. However, municipalities on the other side have not. They haven't done the investments in doing the training of being anti-bias in hiring for municipalities or for their boards of ed or their superintendent's office. So there is the superintendent or assistant superintendent in Connecticut tells a story about having his PhD and interviewing for superintendent positions or assistant superintendent positions. And despite having all the credentials, kept being told he wasn't the right fit. And it's just an interesting situation. It's like, so, and then he would watch his peers interview for the same position, not being as heavily credentialed as he was, being overlooked and being given the opportunity to take time to get the certificate that was a requirement to be a superintendent. And he kept being turned down and saying he wasn't the right fit. That's because I think in hiring, there's a lot of research around anti-bias hiring and training practices, but we haven't done that work in education. I think when we talk about minority teacher recruitment and retention, there's a lot of, recently I heard at a Board of Ed meeting, they said, well, we've been going to career fairs to find people of color to hire. And I was sitting there, I was like, I'm 35 years old. I've never been to a career fair to find a job. So if you think that's how you're going to be recruiting new teachers and teachers of color in 2019, that I think that premise is just false. And so therefore another community said, well, we emailed 500 people and no one responded. And it was just like, also, once again, there's no intentionality in you affirming that you want teachers of color. You emailed 500 people and no one responded. So that's just, municipalities have not been doing the work and the intentional.
Right, and like building the networks and the trust in order for that to really start to happen. I want to go back to your story for a minute, because it strikes me that people could look in at your life and say, oh, come on, you grew up in a village with 2% literacy and went on to Bates College and you're an executive director of an organization. All it takes is hard work on an individual level, and like, yay, Subira, you did it, right? Like, and I'm sure all those things are true, that you worked really hard and that your mom was awesome and, that you had opportunities. But at the same time, I think that narrative of what often I think gets the pushback of some of these conversations is really kids just need to work hard, take individual responsibility, deal with the hardships that come their way, because everybody has hardships, and the exceptional cases will rise to where they're supposed to be, right? So I'm curious how you take your own story and map it in that context of individuals within a system, especially because what we're talking about is histories, networks, systems of trust, systems of advancement or oppression, right? That prevent people from having opportunity. It's not, and I'd love to hear your response to that pushback.
So interesting. So I always say that, and I was like, but the caveat there is my mother has her CPA and was the CFO for Wyndham Hotels and like made a choice to buy a farm in a rural community that had a 2% literacy rate, right? Yeah. So I always say, like, I grew up with a level of privilege in that community that most people didn't. Like, this was her off the grid experience. My mother had me later in life. She was 40 when she had me, and she was like, I'm going to spend time raising my child because I've spent my whole entire life working in corporate. She grew up in the United States, so corporate America, and then she was sent back to Jamaica. So I also recognize that my mother, like, I grew up with immense privilege compared to a lot of people around me, but still also immense privilege compared to a lot of people like in the United States and in Connecticut who are in urban centers. So I challenge that premise, because if my mother did not have the experience that she had, she would have been in survival mode when she had me. She was not in survival mode when she had me. My father had a prominent business, a dry cleaning business. So she was able to homeschool me. Right. It was not a situation of where my mother was working 2 and 3 jobs and then tried to find the time to make sure that I had what I needed for my educational experience. So I also recognize that. And I say, did I not work hard? Yes. But I was not climbing that mountain with a 50-pound sack on my back. Right. And that is what I say to people, like, the false notion that hard work gets you success There is something for another conversation, the opportunity myth. If you look at accountability and the expectations of kids in urban centers, they're a few grade levels behind what they are of their peers. So if you look at even content and curriculum and what's being taught in our under-resourced communities, it cannot compare to what's being taught in our high-resource communities. So the idea, you have many people who will tell you, I graduated from high school in, say, for example, I'll use Waterbury as an example because this is where I live. And I went to college and I was an A student and I had to take remedial courses. That just goes to show you that and if you take remedial courses, the statistics show you are more likely to not graduate from college because you're spending time and energy on classes that are not going to count towards credit for your graduation. So if you think about that, so you did everything right, you worked really hard, you graduated, you got accepted to college, and then now you have this other hurdle that you have to go through and this other obstacle, which is then you have to take remedial courses because you weren't prepared and you're not ready for college. So then you go through and then you fight that battle and you jump through those hurdles, and then say you graduate from college in 5 years. When you're done with college and then you're going to walk into the workplace, you then have to deal with all the discrimination that comes to be a person of color applying for a job in a field that might, so for example, you want to be a teacher. Connecticut has a drastic teaching shortage. There are many teachers of color who are certified who cannot get a job. In the cities, there are classrooms that have long-term subs in the classroom, and they're teachers of color who are certified who are not.
And just not being hired? Like, what's that about?
Not being hired.
Okay. All right.
So let's think about it. You've done everything. You did all the work you needed to do, despite the circumstances, not having the best high quality education, and going. And then you're done, you're at the end, and still it's like, well, you're just not a good fit for the role that we're hiring for. But we will pay a long-term sub to be in this classroom and not have you sit in that seat.
Yeah, there's so many problems. And I do think it sometimes gets to feeling overwhelming when they're all interlocking. We've talked about neighborhoods, we've talked about teachers, we've talked about obviously the attitudes and lack of relationships, and there's poverty that comes into the mix, or all of these things. So I'm curious if people are hearing all this and start feeling like, I care and I do want things to be different. And I'm thinking especially of white listeners who might not live in a diverse community and whose kids do not attend diverse schools. And yet who are saying, yeah, this rings true. This is a problem. I want it to be different. Like, what would you say to that person? Just that kind of solo individual who says, this is where I live, and what would be first steps to advocating for equity in education?
So I think the first step is to know what's happening in your own community, right? I think a lot of times we live in a bubble and we say, well, this is how it is because this is how it is. So I think the first step is knowing. Going and finding out, do you have any policies that affirm hiring educators of color? Is there anything that your district does when there's a vacancy to actually reach out to candidates of color or figure out how to recruit those high quality candidates and have them be a part of your community? The other thing is, when you look at policies, not just in your own community, but in your surrounding communities, how different are they from the policies within your community? Is there a covenant that says you can't have multifamily in your community? If so, reach out to the zoning board, reach out to the person who is in charge and say, why is it that we don't allow multifamily housing in our communities? And then ask about the opportunities to change that. We should be having these conversations and we should be talking about how, as a community, we can affirm anti-racist policies. I think you first have to look inside and then also think about yourself and what are you doing in your daily rituals and practices to ensure that you're living an anti-racist life? Because I think before you can even look out, you have to look inward. When I started doing research on this topic, and I have realized that for a long time, I have lived a life that affirmed white supremacy because all the definitions that I have of success, I told you I went to a very white school, is based upon the premise of a white normative society, and that's the definition of success.
Right.
So you're driven by certain different benchmarks that you hit, and that is what's successful because that is kind of essentially what I've seen and how And I always say, like, my mom kind of grew up in the United States, very similar system. So what she defined as success for me was closely aligned with white supremacy and like a white normative society. So even, and I think being a person of color doesn't necessarily mean that you're an anti-racist, right? You have to really look inward and think about the work that you're doing and how can you make sure that you're positively reaffirming the things that will eventually change your country, where people will not say, for example, I'm colorblind. Like, no, you're not. Like, you do see a color. You may not initially, or you may not think that you ascribe certain attributes to a person based on the color of your skin, but you do have certain biases that are built in, that society has just put upon us. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I do think the first step is just looking inward and making sure that you're doing what you need, and then looking at the policies in the place that you live and asking, why is my community all white?
That's a great question. And I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about on all of this, but I think that's a good place to leave things in terms of asking the questions, starting with your own self, and then extending to your local community, both in terms of why is it all white? But also I think it's so helpful to connect policies to demographics, because it's easy to tell yourself a story of, well, this is just the families that settled here a long time ago, or, well, my grandmother grew up here, or my friend invited me. That social networks do contribute to those things, but so do zoning laws. And who knew? I mean, that's not something that I grew up being aware of, that zoning laws affect who lives in a town. And I think especially in Connecticut right now, you're seeing a lot of towns that are predominantly white with Black Lives Matter signs in their lawns, and protests that happened after George Floyd was killed. And the question is, what does it take for those communities to actually put their activism into action in those communities, and seeing the common good, not just that, wouldn't it be nice if we welcomed those, poor kids from across the line, but what would it be if we both were able to benefit from being in this state together, and more of a sense of mutuality and the common good that we're all going to experience if we actually start to have relationships and start to have connections and start to have schools that equip our kids to learn and grow and work and live together. So awesome. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the time that you gave us today. And I hope we'll talk again soon.
Yes, looking forward to chatting again soon.
All right. Thanks, Subira. I'm so grateful for the practical advice she offers to any of us who want to participate in anti-racism work in our towns, in our communities, in our states, especially as it comes to advocating for kids to get the education that they deserve. Thank you, as always, for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. Today we were talking about Chapter 5 of White Picket Fences, and I'd love to hear what's going on in your towns and communities when it comes to these zoning laws that we're talking about in neighborhoods, as well as the demographics of your public school systems and the opportunities that are available through education in your state or town. If you enjoyed this conversation, as always, please share it with friends, rate and review it wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in next week for another great conversation. Thanks so much for being here.